In some ways, I'm listening to the inputs that you made through yesterday and today as if they speak to South Africa's ongoing and very fledgling new transition. So what is the South Africa of today? I'll just try to paint you a picture before I kind of go into the paper. The continued economic, social, and political marginalization of the country's black majority under apartheid has continued in a democratic South Africa. While many black residents have benefited from the number of economic opportunities prioritized in the post-apartheid country, the spatial legacy means that the significant amounts of the population remain rooted in townships, these living areas designed as nothing more than labor camps, with very little in the way of education, basic services, social services, and economic infrastructure. This has been compounded by post-apartheid social housing developments that have often been built adjacent to these township dwellings. We call them distant township settlements, far from economic opportunity, which further entrenches the spatial divide. The impacts of this are evidenced in the fact that it takes almost an hour for the average resident in the main economic province of South Africa to travel to work. A recent finding says that the trends over the past 20 years are actually quite disturbing. In 1995, that's right after the South African transition, the poorest 40% of the population received about 6% of the national income. Today, that figure is slightly below 6%, notwithstanding a massive expansion of social grants. In 1995, the top 20% of income earners earned about 72% of the national income. That figure today stands at about 70%. For the top 10%, however, the figure has actually gone up. More starkly, the unemployment rate for young black South Africans stands at over 50%. The comparable figure for white South Africans is below 10%. Notwithstanding significant social change, the chasms remain unbearably large. Just to give you a sense, this is from some research that my institute is doing, and the GCRO is part of a partnership between two universities in the main province in South Africa and the provincial government. So this research is based on work that we've been doing, and we say if South Africa was a village of 100 people, 24 of them would live in this main province. 4 of them would have no education at all. 18 have a qualification after high school. 80 people live in a formal dwelling, which means 20 people live in an informal or slum dwelling. 4 people don't have a flush toilet. 23 people are living below the upper bound poverty line in 2011. 11 of these are male, 12 female, so persistent female poverty. 22 are black African and 1 not black African. So you can get a sense of the proportions of poverty among black populations. Youth, 10 of these 23 are below the age of 18 and 13 were aged higher than 18, older than 18. 17 of these 23 lived in formal dwellings and 6 in informal dwellings. And 4 of the poor had no education. So if we think about who are the poor in South Africa, it gives us some sense about that. So I must declare an ironic reality. South Africa, of course, offers a glimmer of hope to countries in conflict for emerging in a peaceful way. And indeed, it was a miracle. It is though thoroughly impossible to tell that story without looking at what it's meant 20 years after the democratic transition. Of course, you know this. Not only would it be untrue to the reality that South Africa faces now, but it will also be disingenuous of the process that we are trying to uncover here in this forum. It doesn't mean that South Africa should not be looked at as a good example or as a hope to academics, public intellectuals, or activists that are by pen or by sword fighting the fight and struggling for a more just society. Quite the opposite, in fact. It presents an example of how it had worked, but how, in light of 20 years post the transition, how it should have worked, and indeed how done over it should have been. Is there a clear answer to this? A question that I asked earlier. No, there's no clear answer to this. The truth is that reconciliation or social relationships can only be sorted out in terms of solidarity now until there's a greater level of economic or substantive equality, as we call it in South Africa. And crucially, this is a question of leadership and a commitment to redress, but doing so in a way that does not alienate or ostracize other South Africans. And that's the kind of rationality. So in this paper, I do not focus on the TRC, nor too much on the narrative of the negotiated settlement, that kind of moment, which has a much longer political narrative attached to it. The universal lessons that emerge from this period, though, remain salient for leadership transitions across the world. So I focus here on the means for building an equal society, even though I show later that there's no agreement on what equality even means. So how to address the inequalities was always a concern in the South African struggle, and particularly an issue to do with leadership. How the struggle for equality was rationalized is the particular focus of this paper. In South Africa, the history of non-racial cooperation, as I said earlier, it's good to kind of look a little bit to the back to figure out where we are now. The history of non-racial cooperation and solidarity was not only a movement for change, but also itself an ongoing struggle. So long before the negotiation, the CODESA and the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the fight for unity among leaders was in some ways the most important fight South Africa was facing towards a future equality. It was the creation of a non-racial, and by non-racial I mean a group of people united beyond their classifications. It was a group or a cadreship of individuals who were part of the African National Congress and other Congress movements. The ANC became a home for all. Now this is key to how it is now. Questions about whether the ANC is still a home for all. I'll skip over a little bit. There was a commitment to forging a united front against apartheid. There were indeed ideological differences during that time in the 1940s and 50s. As you know, one of the main ones was the question of violence. Gandhiist influences through the then Transvaal Indian Congress was instrumental in the commitment to a non-violent struggle, even though it eventually was deemed to be necessary to form Umkhonto we Sizwe, the spear of the nation, the armed wing of the ANC, to engage in a just war against machinery of the state and those institutional infrastructure that represented the perpetuation of apartheid, so those symbols, to make the political point to the people, basically, that we hate the system. So South Africa was not nearly as militarized as current conflicts, as you know, and brutality was the main threat faced, not death necessarily. Of course, many people did die from people who had refused to speak, thrown off buildings, to the 1,000+ young people who boycotted against the education received in the oppressive language. But this is the point, that the forging of this non-racial pact It brought together unity of purpose with those in South Africa, those exiled, and those who would eventually be in jail. Practically, it meant there was a pool of financial support, not for weapons, but for exile, training outside South Africa, and for families of struggle leaders. Of course, a very different time and in one country, not like a region in terms of the area that your organizations are looking at, but even academic discussions or faith-based meetings happened without flair or wastage or ostentation. There was always a commitment of even shared frugality or kind of austerity to identify with the people. Struggle leaders suffered in the same everyday pressures as the people because they were the people. So the quest for equality was a future ideal, but it was also a very immediate reality. If we ask the question, why did the negotiation work? It worked because it had to work. The leadership in prison knew that South Africa needed its leadership. To quote Michael McDonald, Umkhonto we Sizwe, the armed struggle, served an unanticipated purpose. In establishing the ANC bona fides, it positioned the ANC to negotiate on behalf of a township rebellion that originated outside the African National Congress. In some ways, I'm going to quote Mondani here, the great myth of the South African transition is that it was driven by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. The TRC was designed as a surrogate Nuremberg, where the opponents of apartheid sat in judgment over its operatives. Like Nuremberg, the TRC claimed to have granted amnesty for truth, should also have been seen as a performance. It is not the TRC, but CODESA, which made for the real political breakthrough in the South African transition. CODESA, as you know, is the Convention for a Democratic South Africa that included a commitment, a declaration from different parties to bring about an undivided South Africa, to heal the divisions of the past, to strive for the quality of life for all its people. And so it had these principles. It was an agreement in spirit affecting the future, but it was an immediate settlement for a unitary state. So it was a political agreement. For the most part, the result of the pursuit of national unity at the expense of economic and social restitution. This came with its own maladies. Colin Bundy famously commented that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, while groundbreaking in its aim to gain psychosocial healing from the past, unwittingly created a de-racialized insider, where race wasn't important, once you have told your story, and a persistent black outsider. So it created this kind of divide, even in South Africa, of people who had overcome their kind of past by telling it, and those that hadn't. Hein Murray adds that South Africa's transition also comes with an unintentional consequence, that social and economic restructuring would benefit narrow layers of society, while the cost of that restructuring would be deflated onto the rest of the country at a later time. And we're facing that right now. Whether this would be a de facto or just a perceived situation, he argued that a transitional democracy without absolute winners or losers and with a prolonged period of contestation was really going to be at the detriment of a future South Africa. The negotiation did not foresee the nature of contestation as we do have now. In the literature on non-racialism or solidarity beyond race groups, scholars note that it's quite absurd that while the non-racialism struggle had defined contours about this idea of people working across racial lines, the way that a non-racial future would look and how it would come about was really unshaped terrain. The ambiguity of what South Africa and what South Africans would become is its most persistent feature, this ambiguity, a sense of uncertainty. Hein Marais captures this aptly in arguing that the nature of the South African settlement is that it constituted not a rupture, but an increasingly ambivalent series of reconfigurations that also extended far beyond the formal political agreements. So equality, even today in South Africa, is a vague notion at risk of becoming devoid of meaning. It's almost a catch-all for every problem in society in South Africa. It's a rhetorical guiding standard in every document that you see, but it's increasingly vague, while also at the same time having an innate meaning in South African politics. So what does equality mean to the people? Before I read that one out, the series of quotes that I'm about to show you is taken from research that the Ahmed Kathrada Foundation did in 2012. If you know Ahmed Kathrada, he was on Robben Island with Nelson Mandela, and recently his organization initiated the Free Marwan Baguti campaign. So this is what people say. Blacks, including our families, are the real people of South Africa. They see themselves as South Africans, though the most important thing that gives you life is to have money. Though we are poor, it makes you wonder why you should be poor in your country, South Africa, when other South Africans have so much money. This won't stop us from being South African, though. We will always be South African. And that was from a focus group of employed African males. This was another one. The government lies to us. So the moderator says, so tell me one of these lies. That it is going to open up an opportunity for us to be like whites. That we are all going to be equal. They promise us, but do not deliver. So in South Africa, colored means mixed race, and it was classified under apartheid as a particular population group. So it's not a derogatory term as it may be elsewhere. Yes, because everything now is just going for the blacks nowadays. Another quote, we feel like the lesser person, but on that same note, we are equal and they don't want to accept that we are equal. Another quote by African females, I grew up under the oppression. They say we should forgive and forget, but how do you do that when you are standing in one place and they are moving forward? In our quality of life survey that the Gauteng City Region Observatory does every 2 years, we asked people whether they believe a time will come where blacks and whites would ever trust each other. In total, 66% of race groups disagreed that it would be possible. They basically said, there will never come a time where blacks and whites will trust each other, and that was last year in our survey. Of African people, 73% had this kind of hardened attitude that blacks and whites will never trust each other. 61% of coloreds had that attitude, 55% of Indians and 40% of whites, which is quite encouraging. What does it mean for South Africa now? In South Africa, there's an increasing balkanization of society. There are high levels of social distrust. As you've seen in some of those quotes, the resurgence of politics, identity politics, us and them, but framed very much as ethnicist or racist politics, so in terms of ethnic terms. Economic inequality has meant that people put their demands for rights or education or jobs against the rights of others. There's also a high level of legal cynicism, high levels of dissatisfaction with the government and its legitimacy. Now, that links to what I said earlier about this crisis for the very leadership that brought people together, for the African National Congress. At this moment, the kind of dissatisfaction with government is a crisis for the African National Congress that has not become a home for all. And it obviously affects the vote and loss of faith in government. I'm going to show you a couple of slides now. This is from our maps now. This Gauteng is the smallest and most populous province. That's the one I come from. It's an economic powerhouse generating 34% of the country's GDP. The census notes that more than 12 million people live in an area 1.5% the size of South Africa. So it's really concentrated and really dense. So urban politics in this area has come to the fore. What you're looking at here is a map of dissatisfaction with national government in 2009. I'm going to show you 2011, 2013. The yellow represents low levels of dissatisfaction. The redder you go, the more dissatisfied it is. So just watch as the years go by. 2009, 2011, 2013. High levels of discontent with national government. That's about ANC leadership politics. And this is in a country where there's a black majority that has voted for the ANC, and the ANC has brought this country out of its struggle. Within that province, this is the Gauteng local government. So again, the situation, dissatisfaction, 2011, 2013. Equality alone is not the guarantor of social cohesion or legitimacy of the state. However, both of these things, including leadership, will allow people to interact as equals and to foster integration. As Gary Young argues, quote, "As far as it goes, integration is a great thing. The more contact you have with different kinds of people, the less potential there is for stereotyping." Economic inequality and equality for opportunity remains a challenge in South Africa. It's an urgent and continuing task that requires all South Africans, young and old, black and white, to tackle. The situation of equality is not just about people to people, it's about how society interacts with the state. So persistent inequality means that there's growing dissatisfaction with the government, and increased violent protest towards the government, even though people have access to services. In much the same way as non-racialism meant cooperation and solidarity against apartheid in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, it must now also be an attempt to muster and nurture cooperation around issues of economic redress. This is where it's at in South Africa. The contemporary meanings of non-racialism and moving away from racial politics do not mean that the idea of solidarity should be done away with. But if it's going to work as a social practice, there needs to be understanding and acceptance of the terms of bringing about economic benefit for a greater number of disenfranchised black South Africans. And that's where South Africa's change and challenge clearly is right now. Thank you.